Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, all about the great translation debate. Should you centralize or decentralize translation? I'm joined by two great speakers today who are going to essentially be the two sides of that argument. So we have Olga Beregovaya, who is our VP of AI, but she's been in the translation localization space for over 20 years, working with and on translation teams. And then we have Jenn Wong, so our head of AI product strategy, who's also been in the translation space for a while, but as a product manager and product owner. So I think it's going to be a really interesting discussion today between these two, and we'll see if we can settle this debate once and for all. So Jenn and Olga, welcome to the webinar.
Thank you, and thanks for having us.
Of course. Well, before we start with content, just a couple of housekeeping items. So we will be recording this session. So if you need to step away or you want to share this with any of your colleagues after the event, we will share that pretty soon after the event ends. And then the second is if you have any questions for Jenn or Olga, feel free to put them in the Q&A and we will try to get to them at the end, bearing time. So we will kick off with that in mind. So first question, let's just make sure everyone is on the same page. So Olga, what do we really mean when we say centralizing or decentralizing translation?
There are literally only two ways of doing it. Maybe there is a third way, but I'm not aware of. Way one is you would have a centralized organization, right? And that would be a centralized localization. Usually that would be a localization organization that manages your tooling, that manages your translation budget. Sometimes this organization would have a P&L, sometimes this organization would be a cost center, but basically you have everything one place. You have tooling, you have budget, you take input from local marketing in as whether to localize or not localize into this language. But all in all, there is one unit within the organization that is responsible for everything language. So that's your centralized version.
And what does decentralized look like?
Okay, and then there is a decentralized, and we've seen it, I mean, especially when we work with corporations like large companies, it happens quite often that either you have pockets and you have different localization organizations for different product divisions, or even less so, local in-country offices would work with local agencies, or there would be maybe local offices would have in-house translators, and rarely would you see centralized technology like a translation management system in such a scenario. So these are the two scenarios I'm aware of. And maybe there is one dimension to centralization. You would usually have a quality organization. You would have a group within the centralized log that would be responsible for translation quality and have translation quality as their KPIs. So that's my take on what centralized and decentralized is.
Awesome. Go ahead, Jenn.
Yeah, so I was actually just going to kind of bring up my experiences with decentralized because being from product, we are usually kind of the ones that often want to wander away from the centralized organizations, even if there is one at within organizations, mostly because of the speed of delivery and also kind of the pace of which we have to actually work. So in my previous kind of roles, I've worked in a lot of B2B enterprise situations. So not really B2C, that's a whole different story because there your localization is a big key factor in terms of how successful your product rollout is going to be. So there's a little bit more focus in that area, but they still come under the same pressures as similar to kind of B2B enterprise software. So I've been in implementation phases for kind of translocalization software in products and software, mostly for B2B. And what that means is actually we often pick what tool we find the most useful at the moment because we need something quick. We need a really fast turnaround. We don't want to spend a lot of time in terms of the integration. So you need something really quick and simple to integrate. In these organizations, generally with the centralized structures, especially if centralized structures work with a lot of kind of LSPs actually, it becomes a little bit more difficult for us to work with that because we have sprints especially if you work in Agile, you have sprints of 2 weeks. That means you conceive a feature, you kind of do the testing, you do the design, and then you write the code, and then it's live within 2 weeks. And that's really hard to fit an entire kind of other localization process in it. So we've always had to kind of kind of carve out our own little decentralized section in product. I know I've spoken to quite a lot of low managers who are kind of like, it's kind of very difficult sometimes to get on board with product because we do have similar KPIs and goals in terms of, getting the product out there, making sure that we have the same brand identity. But because we are on such tight timelines and kind of want to go through the iteration much faster, we think of the language part of it, the entire localization part, as something you can also iterate. We just put it out there and we go, we can fix it if it's not right. We just kind of keep going with it for better or for worse. I mean, everybody has their pick at that point. But yeah, so that's definitely something I faced previously in the past, which leads a lot of decentralization, because once you start with one department kind of carving out their own section, you're not gonna, it's actually a struggle to get everybody re-centralized, because that means taking time to kind of implement new software technology in a department. That's time that you're not spending on actually building something else. So we totally understand that. And it's something we struggle with, actually.
Is it time to debate yet, Cassie?
Please.
I'm only going to say one sentence, which would be yes, but a well-designed centralized process actually is designed specifically to support continuous log for the agile environments. So you have the right tech stack that actually helps you support continuous log. You actually might win through the centralized approach if you need to support your 2-week sprints. So here's a different opinion. But
yeah, definitely. But so I think a little bit to go, we're going back and forth here. So I definitely agree. I mean, I see that as a huge asset, especially if there are already other tools, or we can use kind of, I mean, the biggest thing is the translation memory or glossary terms. I think glossary terms are the biggest ones that we've always kind of in product had difficulty aligning with our marketing, because whatever we call it in the product, it should also be what our marketing team is calling it on the ground. But I think the most interesting thing here is actually when we implement it for a lot of product, especially if you're talking about those really short keywords, we have other systems to kind of reuse it. So we try to cut down on quite a lot of things, because that TM is going to be different from your marketing TM, right? At some point, because you just have really short strings, and sometimes they need a lot of context. It's a lot of UI context. And then we also just kind of do it ourselves, especially while looking at other websites, or especially with MT. MT was super popular for software translations because it's quick, it's small, and then you can always go back and fix it with like basically zero cost. If somebody doesn't like it, somebody complains about it, you just go in, you fix it. You don't have to kind of do an entire process there. So it'd be very interesting to hear your thoughts on how to simplify that one a little bit more.
Don't have an answer. Next question.
I love it. No, I think this is great. I mean, you've proven why this is a debate, right? It seems like people end up in a decentralized state because they feel like centralization may slow them down, or maybe they have elements in a centralized platform or process that is not needed in certain use cases, but that comes at a cost, right? So let's talk a little bit about why aren't we all just decentralized? What is the impact of having misalignment? And maybe Olga, I'll start with you on this one.
Okay, start with me. And as you guys can hear, I'm obviously a proponent of centralization. I think we touched on a lot of it. First of all is the cost control, right? I'm pretty confident that if you have budget control within a single organization, you know how much you spend, you have reporting, you have your BI function. So it's much easier. If I were the CFO, I'd probably want to see my translation spend and my globalization spend reported from a single unit. Unless, of course, there is some BI magic that's happening so that all the spend is tracked across the entire organization. So that's one. Same for budgetary purposes. I've seen organizations with, here is a TMS, here is Catalyst, here is like something else, here is DAM. And then again, you spend unnecessary money on redundant technology. Whereas if you had a centralized approach, you could pick best in class. And yes, Jenn, it might slow you down initially, I agree. But at the same time, you don't spend on excessive tooling. Next one, and again, actually just spoke to a huge corporation where Jenn, what you mentioned is translation memories and terminology. Their terminology is all over the place. for different languages, and the brand book is not necessarily respected exactly because of decentralized linguistic asset management process or absence thereof, right? Or complete absence thereof when linguistic assets reside, like say with marketing or with local marketing. So I see, and maybe another one. Now, let me touch on AI, right? Because I mean, that would be inevitable to touch on AI. What we see, and it's a two-edged sword, and I really would love to hear from Jenn on that one. Now, AI is so accessible, right? LLM, like, I mean, put in your credit card or whatever, get your department, sign up your department to say OpenAI, right, or Claude or any other model. And then you start running your multilingual initiatives between different departments in isolation. And before you know it, here is like a multilingual initiative on the product side, and here is a multilingual initiative on the legal side, right? And while they all have different needs, would it not be best if there was a governing unit within the localization organization that could actually help pick best in class for specific use cases? I may be overcomplicated, but again, I've spoken to quite a few managers that say it's a little bit of a challenge for them to discover those AI-driven pockets of multilingual initiatives across the organization. So don't know, Jenn, if you want to dispute that one.
Yeah, so I totally agree for budget. If we don't have to ask for extra budget, it's even better, because every time you ask for budget, it's kind of like a fight on how much you need to ask for. But I think actually it brings up a very interesting point. I 100% agree with the concept that with the introduction of AI, you can have this kind of centralized, basically localization control unit where you can actually kind of license out or enable different departments to use parts of your kind of AI initiative in order to actually do the translations, so that you still have that speed and you saw the reduction in cost, oversight, and quality and shared assets. 100% agree with that. I think it actually brings up an interesting debate about whether or not AI will be centralized or decentralized, because as we've seen, and as Olga touched upon, is there are quite a lot of small pockets of AI development going on within each department across industries, because or across departments, because everybody's being kind of encouraged to integrate AI into their kind of work environment. But the rate of integration, and we even see like the rate of models coming out, the rate of new use cases it can handle, are kind of exponential, and it's not something one team can keep up with. So the question I have is actually kind of, how are we going to re-centralize all these smaller pockets? Because I mean, that was one of the biggest things that we had in the past was, most of the times, especially depending on the organization, if the centralized localization unit was using kind of more of a longer process and didn't focus on the shorter, quicker processes, it was hard to get into it because there was quite a lot of onboarding time, which is why we kind of picked our own tooling. And a lot of TMS tooling is designed with marketing use cases in mind. I mean, that was the origin of kind of localization, right? You started with kind of, how do you talk to markets? How do you talk to different markets around the world? And then, especially when the kind of tech revolution came up, all of a sudden you had a different use case of, now we have all these small strings on this website. Like, we're not even talking about blogs or marketing content, but like actual kind of like usability things that came up, and it was kind of shorter. We had faster turnaround times, and it's kind of a little bit different. And unless you had a really seasoned localization manager in your organization who could jump on it quickly, it became difficult for a lot of people to adopt kind of having a centralized unit with tooling for departments with different use cases that came up. So I 100% agree that if we can have a centralized kind of AI localization like tool, then it would enable quite a lot of different teams to kind of jump on that same system.
I think there is another dimension to it, and that's different models. And as Jenn said, like, I wake up to a new model every morning, or 5 new models every morning. But we do a lot of benchmarking here at Smartling. We actually have a whole department, a whole team within our deployment department that does pretty sophisticated, both automated and human annotated benchmarking between different models. And equally, machine translation, more traditional NMT models, and LLMs, each of them would have its own tone of voice, right? Each of them would hallucinate in its own particular way, or deliver great quality content in its own way. And it's perfectly fine if it's internal comms, right? If it's an employee training or something. But once you start pushing content to the market, produced by different engines and different large language models, before you know it, you might be jeopardizing your brand consistency, because indeed those different models may sound completely differently. And even more so will they sound differently if they're not trained or fine-tuned. Then you really, again, you could easily put your brand at jeopardy. Now, for internal tooling, that's obviously a completely different story, especially if it's for gisting, for processing, for understanding. That's where you're looking for actionability and not care about tone much. So here's another little token of that's why I'm very much pro centralization, just for brand protection and brand promotion purposes.
Awesome. Well, I can tell that this is a difficult debate. So maybe we'll break it down a little bit into each category, and that can help us get a little bit of an answer between the two of you. We'll see. So let's start with technology. We've already talked a little bit about this, but maybe Jenn, you could summarize the kind of pros of centralization and the pros of decentralizing your technology, like specifically within a TMS or even within, as Olga mentioned, AI technology.
Yeah, so I think I'll start with pros of centralization to kind of take a little bit of a different view here. So I think definitely one of the pros of centralization is that everybody is kind of speaking the same language, using the same language when they're actually even producing content, but also translating content. You get universal linguistic assets in terms specifically terminology and also tone of voice, but that always depends on kind of like how you have everything set up. Definitely great for budgets because you can probably manage it better and you can reduce the cost there. I think and then switching over to decentralization, really about moving faster and kind of having less overhead of always having to go to that centralized unit. Just in general, speed at that aspect is kind of what we always drove for when we talked about decentralized.
Yeah. Speaking of budget, we did have a question come in that I think would be appropriate to ask now from Gabriel. So you plan for your yearly budget, doing your best to forecast, but how do you handle big unplanned spend spikes from certain teams? So either of you can kind of answer this, or any thoughts on how do you kind of manage those spikes if you're not in the know, you're not like part of that team?
Pro for decentralization. Sorry.
Maybe you can go first, because again, I have an opinion that's pro centralization. So
yeah. I think for pro for decentralization in this aspect in terms of budgeting is that you kind of plan your yearly roadmap. You know exactly what kind of decisions your team is going to face in the year, and then you can account for everything. You can have very, very granular kind of breakouts of these are the potential things that might come up, and you can generally forecast and see some bigger items that are going to come. Of course, there's always surprises in that aspect, but we always did we looked at our previous year spend, and then we looked at the new features, how did they compare, and then we kind of created a budget there. That being kind of very, very decentralized, we had like kind of our own purview, so it was easier for us to control, but that doesn't speak to kind of bubbling that up to a centralized unit. And then I'll pass this over to Olga.
Yeah, and I would say, I mean, first of all, you're absolutely right. I completely agree with you that usually you would know what the future, usually know your roadmap, right? Unless, again, in the current climate, maybe you need to react to market like this at lightning speed. But let's say you usually know your roadmap, and then usually you would know your collateral across the organization, right? You would know the contractual docs that you need to create. You would usually know the marketing assets that you would need to create to push a certain feature or a certain product to the market. So I would guess that there is a pretty high level of predictability. Again, unless you need to react to market motion quickly. But in that case, there is a spike in the spend that's expected to translate into a spike of the revenue, right? And if you are viewed as a support function, say you suddenly decide to go into, I don't know, name it, whatever, right? You suddenly decide to go to like an set of African countries. You expect the revenue from those countries. So I would imagine that you should get your budget automatically because it will convert into money on the other side. So I think each spike is justified and each spike is tied to money. And that's how you actually can deviate from your planned budget.
Yeah, and I think one thing we talked about as we were kind of prepping for this as well, Olga, is that visibility. So making sure that as a localization team, you have visibility of the roadmap and you're not just kind of pushed to the side. So can you talk a little bit about that visibility and how local teams are getting more involved?
It's not even visibility. I would say I would probably call it more seat at the table. And again, I've been in the industry for like forever. It's like good 25 years. And I've experienced that on the buyer side. And I've actually spoken about it in different forums and different panels. When I was leading or being one of the leaders in a localization function, localization quite often, and maybe to date, was an afterthought. Right. And that hurts in different ways. First of all, again, it's very hard to plan your budget, your supply chain, but even more so when the product is designed not with localization on mind, then that's where you have internationalization issues, right? And before you know it, localization inherits a product with a ton of hard-coded strings, or the product that's not set up for, I don't know, variables, gender, metric units, and so on and so forth. And again, if it's random pockets, and again, like say, imagine there are local offices that work with local agencies, there is much more risk that these things would leak through. And I'm very, very pleased to see that the role of internationalization engineer and globalization engineer is now planted deeply with product organizations, has a voice, has a say, and is informed. So that's one. Second, indeed, localization, like I've spoken to CEOs that, what? Localization what? Do I have this in my company? So the visibility was really, really low. And I think it's also when you have the centralized org, it's very easy for you to have that seat at the table. And I've seen, and now leader of localization or global content delivery, however the departments are called, is actually there alongside other leaders, having a voice and which geo to go into, talking about BI, being able to provide BI on how translated product actually converts into sales in the region. So the role of centralized localization department has expanded tremendously thanks to that centralization. Another aspect I touched on the supply chain, and I'm a huge proponent of centralization because this is where you can work with your language partner and you can outsource the operations. First, you can plug in AI and a lot of technology, but you can also outsource a lion's chunk of your operations and turn your centralized localization department into a strategic unit rather than an in-house translation agency. So here's another one.
Awesome. And you're leading into my next question, which is about strategy. So when you think about the strategy for globalization, internationalization, localization, what are the pros and cons of having that centralized versus decentralized, maybe into geo offices, for example?
I think it's Jenn's turn because I already spoke my mind.
You got to answer this one, but if Jenn wants to go first, she can.
Okay.
So, I think, how do I put this? So in terms of strategy, we see this across different enterprises, not only for localization in terms of geo offices for kind of marketing and kind of communication within specific regions, but we also see this with product because the products always need to be adapted. It's that we talk a lot about kind of localization as kind of like a translation unit, but if we really kind of broaden out localization on a strategic level and we bring it into product, like Olga was talking about, we're talking about localization in a different manner. There's a reason why kind of, for people that have traveled a lot, if you go and you look at kind of washers and dryers from different countries, all the symbols look different because specifically inherently different regions and different cultures have a different understanding of what these symbols mean. And that means that actually this is where localization comes in on product strategic level is because when you're talking about, translating your product, you're not just talking about, okay, I just need it in a different text. Like it needs to be either a different kind of script or it needs to be a different language. It's about kind of really localizing how that product would function, how it fits into a specific geolocation, into the culture that's inherently there, and also working with the language and the people there. So I think in that aspect, kind of maybe for decentralization, it is very important that geo offices kind of have their own strategic kind of lead and actually feed into a greater product discussion. I've seen it quite recently that there's quite a lot of product teams where they have product managers that are separated also, like geolocated, in order to kind of understand and capture customer information, customer feedback from specific regions as well.
To that, it's absolutely true. But I would like to add to that I've seen, capitalizing, Jenn, on what you said for once, I'm not going to argue here. Yes, in country marketing awareness and understanding of what hyperlocalization for this market would actually mean and cultural localization, it's essential. But again, if you imagine, and I'm going to take it back to AI and to LLMs, imagine that you've received your input from your geos, and then you've trained, fine-tuned a model that actually knows how to hyper-localize and how to translate for a specific market. Then having that, again, translating into next generation or current generation state-of-the-art tech, I would say that such a centralized unit that is able to fine-tune the translation process to geo needs, again, is going to be very efficient. It's going to be cost effective, and you can produce not just human, but automated translations that will be adapted to local needs, because you have this unit of data scientists, computational linguists, and experts that can actually consolidate this knowledge and translate it into technology-driven, technology-based delivery. And in this case, AI would not be a buzzword. It would be really AI-driven delivery.
Yeah, I guess in order for that to really happen, we would need some of these AI model building companies to also decentralize a little bit, because we do notice that a lot of the AI models are very Western based, right? A lot of their feedback is very Western based. Like the way we talk, or the way GPT talks back to me, is very American. I would never go, this must be a German or a French person writing this. Like, that's not kind of in the nature. And also, we need to kind of really diversify the type of content that we actually feed and train models with. And this goes into a very big and different topic in terms of kind of AI ethics, and actually kind of broadening the scope of exactly how we look at models and how we qualify good models at the end of the day.
Which again is perfectly well done through centralized org. So what I would also want to see, and I've actually had very interesting conversations with localization managers and product managers about it, and actually marketing managers about it, that localization, even if different pockets of technology and knowledge and everything that Jenn is talking about, of course they will exist. But what if localization becomes this governing body that ensures that we have that ensures that the right tooling is deployed, that this tooling is compliant with local regulations, and like basically, again, helping select best in class and all those great things that Jenn talked about. But being that governing body could be an advisory body. It doesn't necessarily make decisions for decentralized organization, but at the very least could provide information and give advice and give recommendation.
Great. Well, speaking of teams, let's chat about teams a little bit, and specifically localization teams. Like, should they be centralized in one place, or should they be decentralized around the globe? I know, Jenn, you said something interesting about local teams as we were prepping as the originators of remote work. So maybe you want to chat about that a little bit.
Yeah. So to be very honest, I think the localization industry is kind of the spearheader for remote work. Everybody, if you wanted somebody that could actually, like a translator that would localize for you for a specific region, you want to get somebody from that region, right? Because languages and cultures grow. It's not static. I see it when I meet people that have left the country. I see it in myself. After leaving the United States for 13 years, it's a little bit different now when I go back. So it's, there is inherent decentralization in localization industry, and it's kind of, I mean, with across all industries, and actually talking about that a little bit more, and as the debate goes on, I see it more as kind of less about decentralized versus centralized. I see it more as how much should be centralized, what should be centralized, and what should be decentralized. Because a centralized unit does make sense. Don't get me wrong. Like having somebody that's gonna kind of like have an overview of the entire localization process within the organization, being in charge of quality, being in charge of the processes, being in charge of the tone and voice, any terminology, kind of even coordinating across all the different markets. But how much of it should be centralized and how much should be decentralized? Because of course you're still not going to use, if you want something reviewed by a local native, you're still not going to use somebody that hasn't lived in that country or spoken that language on a daily basis for 20, 30 years, right? At the end of the day.
So I'd probably add to this. That was a fun fact, and I agree completely. Localization pretty much invented by virtue of what we do. We invented remote work. At some point, a group of friends, localization industry friends, and myself, we wanted to put together a panel on the quote unquote localization spell, which is basically you have your colleagues in China, you have your colleagues in India. I worked for a department like this, me being in the US, people, project management in Eastern Europe, then you have quality managers around the world, and you literally have colleagues around the globe. And the only reason why we could not put together this panel is because we didn't have a solution. And we were just, okay, so here we sit with a problem statement. We have nothing to tell the world. We've tried everything. And again, the organization can be centralized org-wise, but geographically, to Jenn's point, you do want to be in country most of the time, right? To be in touch with the local phenomena. There is always something like, like best practices that I've seen is you take turns, right? So the awake person, the person awake at midnight is different. Like it rotates. You record, of course, you can record. You can have smaller team meetings, or you can just collaborate completely offline and cut your meeting time and the actual dynamic meeting time to that absolute minimum. I'm again a proponent of course, all these functions and geos should collaborate, but I think we need to be very creative in terms of how we do that, so there is no such thing as a person awake at midnight for the rest of options, for the lack of options.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think, Olga, we sometimes have you up at 6 a.m. on the West Coast to meet with Jenn, so not an ideal scenario.
I completely argue with us sometimes, but yes, I mean that's yeah. But hey, look, I'm just going to produce a digital human, right? And just plan the digital twin and plan the digital twin until your meeting. So Jenn, don't be surprised.
Awesome. All right. Well, last point is on key performance indicators, metrics. Do those change or vary at all when you choose one of these options between centralization and decentralization? And what does that kind of look like between the two? So Olga, maybe I'll have you start there on what are the kind of KPIs for a centralized org versus decentralized?
I think it's becoming very, very interesting in the industry recently because and it's still a KPI, translation quality, right? And we measure translation quality using automated metrics, and we use MQM and human reviewers. But traditional view on local organization KPI has been number of errors per 1,000 words, right? Or bugs, like say globalization bugs that are not caught through functional testing. Those KPIs have not gone anywhere. But what I think is super interesting that a centralized localization org now has KPIs in terms of product and content in country impact. And that's actually, I think it's very, very fair, both to the in-country sales force and to that centralized org, because you see the impact of your work and your KPIs are measured through conversion, through in-country sales. So I see localization KPIs being tied much more to business. And the centralized org, again, there are, of course, multiple other variables, but the quality of your translation, the relevance, to Jenn's point, the relevance of your product to global market is one of the KPIs. And of course, if you have a centralized org, consistent KPIs, cost, right? Doing more with less. And again, if you are a centralized localization org, it's much easier to control and implement the doing more with less through your tech strategy, through your vendor strategy. And it's much easier to report to your stakeholders and your financial business unit when you are that centralized org. So money, quality, impact, speed, that these are the KPIs, and impact is the new and very, very interesting one. I've seen innovation, actually. I've seen innovation as one of the KPIs for localization organizations, how much innovation you've actually brought to the org when it comes to the multilingual processes and the company's global presence.
Great. Well, we kind of had different answers for each one of these things. So I guess the real question is, do you even have to pick? Can you just have, I think, Jen, you kind of talked about this a little bit already, but can you have some centralization, some decentralization, or is it all or nothing? And Jen, I'll start with you on that one, since you already chatted about it.
Yes, as I mentioned before, I'm kind of like jumping at it. I believed in partial centralization and partial decentralization. I think there are quite a lot of things like kind of the tooling, the processes, definitely the linguistic assets and how you want to be perceived as a brand and the terminology used, that should definitely be centralized. I mean, with decentralized, you kind of have it harder to align that because there's no one person that's kind of going to make that final call or kind of make that ruling. So in that sense, centralization is good for kind of overall perception and overall effectiveness and cost. I do believe in that the centralized organization needs to provide decentralized tools and capabilities, and not just rigid capabilities and tools, because I mean, if you want to actually kind of talk about cost, you don't want to constantly have to go back to a team and go, is this project working for you? Is this process working for you? Because we iterate processes quite frequently. You want to look for whatever's not working. You don't want to look for what's not working and then report to somebody and wait for them to tell you what to do next, right? You want to be able to be kind of independent, agile with your own processes, and be able to play with the tool itself within boundaries. And I think that's the important thing about being centralized is the decentralized part, there's always going to be some sort of decentralized part, needs to have flexibility and the capability to play within their own space to make it work for them at the end of the day.
Okay, let me try and pick up. I agree completely. It may be, I wouldn't go with all or nothing, but I would go with 80-20. I'm still a strong believer that centralized organization will deliver much more consistent outcomes, but there is that other 20% that can be decentralized and for reasons such as, again, cultural adaptation or maybe local product flavor. I'm a strong believer in RACI. Like RACI is my religion. So I would just say that even if you have the centralized organization, it is essential that the organization is informed of what's relevant for the local market. So I think you can still win a lot with centralization, but with the right communication, the right division of responsibilities, and the right feedback loop. What I've seen, and maybe just taking a step back a little bit, I've seen marketing assets, and somehow it mostly applies to high marketing, right? I've seen marketing assets that are so tailored to the US market and with complete lack of input from the countries that would be not localizable in any form and shape. I have an example on mine, but I'm not going to use it. It's actually what's called wordplay in English. And because the local organizations did not have a say and were not consulted, there was absolutely like the brand found itself completely inconsistent across the globe. So I would say 80-20.
Okay, great. And last question is, how can you tell if your approach is working? And, what are signs of maybe lack of efficiency or drawbacks? Maybe you're not 80-20, maybe you're 50-50, and you want to know if that's actually working for you or not. So what are some of the warning signs that we might see if you're not in balance the way you need to be?
I already mentioned, I'll start on that one. Decentralization can lead to inconsistency, complete brand inconsistency. And if you suddenly find out that your product or any kind of concept is translated differently between, like, what happens now, I mean, obviously you'll have different translation for Korea from Japan, but what if your glossaries that are used in Japan have not been updated on the source side, on the English side for years, because you're not even aware that there is certain content drift. So I would say the inconsistency in terminology and linguistic assets, and if you find those pockets of inconsistencies, that'd be the first one. And usually that could be inconsistent source, especially if you don't have a translation memory. So any kind of naming inconsistency across geos, that would be the first one, the first sign. And then again, I would say that technologically, you may find out that you spend a lot on technology that you would not have spent if you had a centralized approach. And then also, it's not only that, it's not just the money, it's also interoperability. If you have decentralized approach, you can find yourself in a place where content coming from different tooling, from different tools is completely not interoperable. And your software strings are not going to work with your DAM, even more so in different languages. And say your, I think software strings and the way they would work with authored content and DAM would be like, if you see those signs, that would be another one. Again, if you're on the localization side of the house and you receive a hard-coded string, something is off, right? Not internationalized string. So I would say budget, brand damage, interoperability, and lack of internationalization. If you see any of these signs in your organization, then probably you're not doing something right. And maybe vendor centralization, like if you find out that your organization works with, like, I don't know, 40 vendors across the globe, right? Each of them doing things in their own way. That could be, okay, hey, am I spending my money wisely? Can I not centralize my supply chain? Can I not centralize my vendor pool? So that would be the indicators, that would be the red flags that I'd be looking for.
Yeah, Jen, from the product and marketing side, what's kind of the sign that maybe you're not engaging with a centralized function as much as you could be?
I think one big, so it's everything that Olga just mentioned, to be very honest. I think the bigger thing is, I mean, if you're not decentralized enough, you'll know, because it's more of a how long did it take you to resolve this issue kind of deal. If it takes too long, if you have to jump through too many hoops, and the number of people that have to touch a problem before it gets resolved. If you kind of have to keep passing it in a chain to people and kind of moving the problem away from you in order to solve it, then you're probably not autonomous enough in your decentralization to actually, or in your centralization, you're not autonomous enough to actually resolve the problem yourself. And that can be a big red flag. So that's something that you kind of have to like ensure that either the centralized part of the organization is actually going to respond and kind of give you autonomy, or produce kind of different processes or other tooling to help you resolve these problems in the future. Or you kind of have to have a real discussion about, hey, maybe this is something that we have to take care of externally outside of the centralization in a decentralized manner, and then we move on. I think there's always a rating of exactly how impactful it is and how much does it actually translate across, right? So if you have a problem that's more related to kind of like the brand tone of voice or the brand image, of course, that's going to be with the centralized unit. But if it's something that's kind of within your purview, within your control, like, hey, the name on this button, or kind of small things like that, you should be able to manage it yourself autonomously, or kind of like do research so that you're not constantly waiting on anybody to help you. I think that's a big thing to see.
Yeah, so it seems like communication is key regardless, between orgs that are relying on localization teams and localization teams that are trying to serve the other organizations and make sure things are working for everyone. So awesome. Well, that wraps up our content. Any last comments, ladies? That was a lot that we talked about.
My only last comment would be really, you guys know your organization better than anyone else, and you would know what makes sense for you. I don't think there is a silver bullet. There are pros and cons. I mean, look, Jenn has her opinion, I have my opinion, but I think at the end of the day, you look at, okay, how does my organization function, right? Is it vertical? Is it product-based? Is it horizontal functions? And once you've mapped out this matrix on your mind, then that's where you would make your decision. Again, I've seen huge successes in some form of centralization to some extent. So, but again, what makes sense for you?
Yeah.
And
Every
obviously,
organization is different.
And obviously, as owners of translation management platform and technology, I'll wear my Smartling hat for a moment. If you centralize your processes within a single platform, obviously you win a lot on efficiencies. Otherwise, companies like ours would not exist, right? And we do exist, and we do help you with centralized processes.
Yeah. And Arena has a great point in the chat. Another perk of centralization is that it brings more visibility and influence to an L10 department, which results in more awareness and probably more communication that's happening. So it kind of feeds itself in that way.
Absolutely, 1000%. That visibility, awareness, ability to influence upstream. That's a huge one, right? Sorry, it's just last minute. I wish we had another hour, but I'm sure those of us who've been in the industry for some time, and maybe even to date, we know that sometimes the authored content is just very hard. The translatability of the authored content is not there, right? It's super complex. It's super grammatically complex. It contains a lot of local source language phenomena. And quite often we would say like, hey, but we can't really influence upstream. We really don't have a say, right? With the afterthought, we're like down the supply chain. And absolutely 1000% agree with you, Arena. Now, not only do you have visibility, but you can actually go to your writers, you can go to your marketers, and you can actually say, hey guys, this is not going to play with our tooling, and this is not going to play with our human workforce. So visibility and influence, and that had definitely on my watch, and I've been in the industry forever, again, that has changed dramatically. And I agree, that's a perk of centralized org.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much, Tutu. We do have one more Back to Basics webinar happening in March, all about linguistic assets and how that can be a local multiplier. So we'll be talking everything from how to build those assets to how to optimize them over time, and then how to use them in really cool ways, especially with AI. So join us for that one in March. And thanks so much to both of you guys for all of your helpful info and debate. We hope you guys learned a little something and came away with maybe an answer about this topic.
Thank you so much, and thanks for moderating, Cassie. It was fun.
Bye.
Thank you.